All right, so this is a video to provide an overview of assessment and purposes of assessment, and it correlates to the first chapter in the Chapuis text, which is called Classroom Assessment, Every Student a Learner. So what is assessment? When we think about just the different definitions of assessment that are out there, assessment is basically coming up with a systematic way to gather evidence to show what your students have learned about something. Here, McTeague provides a similar definition, a systematic basis for making inferences about characteristics of people based on various sources of evidence. So we collect the evidence to say this child is proficient in third grade math, or whatever the area is. Wiggins states the aim of assessment is to educate and improve student performance, not merely to audit it. So that definition points to the formative aspects of assessment. So assessment should not just be summative in nature, but should give students and teachers information that will help them improve their own learning and growth. And then the final definition here, assessment is the collection, synthesis, and interpretation of an information to aid in teacher decision making. And that goes along with the other two in that we need to have various sources of evidence, and that should help us make decisions, instructional decisions. So that's why assessment is a key aspect of the teaching and learning cycle, which we'll show you a little bit later. So what are some reasons why we assess? So think about in your mind, why are some reasons that we might assess? We might assess to make sure that kids have mastery of the content that we're teaching, or that they are able to do something in a way at a level that we're expecting. So in general, and we'll be going into this in further depth as we read our text, there are two broad categories of knowledge that or of areas that we generally assess for. So those would be, one is knowledge, like facts, like that you can add numbers together, or that you can explain the causes of the Civil War. So specific knowledge of events, of facts that exist. And then along with knowledge goes reasoning, because all facts can be interpreted in different ways, so we want students to develop reasoning skills so that they can analyze and apply the knowledge that they are gaining. But they have to have knowledge in order to reason about something. If they don't have the knowledge, they really can't do the reasoning piece. And then the second category, broad category, which we could probably narrow down a little bit more to, are skills. So, for example, in science, we want students to develop the skill to be able to apply the scientific method, for example. So skills often go along with creating new things or performance. And then I would say that there's a third area, but it's an area that is much more challenging to assess, and I think is less given a little bit less attention, and those would be attitudes or dispositions. And that's an area that is addressed in our text, but it's a little bit more challenging to assess these soft skills. So that might be things like being able to work well with others, or showing appreciation of something. And those are learning goals that we might have for kids, but I just find in general that they tend to be more challenging to assess. Okay, assessment literacy. Teachers need to develop knowledge and skill around assessment because we need to be able to gather accurate information about student learning and student achievement. A lot of times teachers, and sometimes I probably fall victim to this as well, we focus a lot on developing excellent lesson plans that are aligned to the standards and then sort of assume that the students are learning and maybe don't plan enough around the formative assessments throughout said unit. So teachers, it's really important part of teaching to have the knowledge and the skills to gather information about our students' achievement, and sorry for the missing apostrophe here, and then use the assessment process to improve achievement, and I think along with that engage the students themselves in goal setting, in self-reflection, and in monitoring their own learning rather than always being measured by somebody else. You know, in schools, you'll hear the terms assessment, evaluation, and measurement, and sometimes you'll hear them used interchangeably, but really measurement is the measuring part, the part where you're actually coming up with a way to quantify. Oftentimes, or sometimes we use a rubric, which would be more, describing the quality of something, but the measurement is like how we are measuring whether something has happened, and then the evaluation is putting a value onto that measure. So I could get, a 500 on a test, but I wouldn't know the value of it unless I figured out, well, what is that number worth with regards to how many points the test was worth, or with regards to the significance of the test, things like that. So the evaluation piece is adding value to the measurement that we have conducted. So again, measurement is a way that we have, a lot of times, a way that we have found to quantify characteristics of individuals, but doesn't have to be quantitative, can be qualitative as well. And then evaluation combines those measures with our evaluation of how desirable or how important those measures are. And so evaluation is, like I said, assessment is measurement plus evaluation together. So here's a fairly dated example, but performance on a test that indicated a student was unable to spell number words, that would be important if the child then had to learn how to write a bank check. So that's prerequisite knowledge. So that knowledge is important, hopefully. How should we assess? So a lot of times, especially, for example, in college, we might have just a couple of assessments that our whole grade is based upon, but as K-12 teachers, that's usually not the case. We have to find multiple sources of evidence that are collected over time that provide us a picture of our students' achievement on different learning goals. So the metaphor of a photo album is much more appropriate for assessment versus a snapshot. Another super important concept that we'll be discussing throughout the course, especially in the beginning half of the class, is the idea of making sure that your assessment evidence is matched to the learning goal or learning target. And the term learning target is what the authors use to discuss like learning objectives, and that's what we're going to be using as well. Those are like your lesson level learning objectives. So, if you've ever been in a class where you take the class, you attend, you participate, you're learning what's being taught, and then you go to take the test and you have no idea like half the things that are on the test. That's an example of the teacher not thoroughly thinking through whether the assessment evidence was matched to the learning goals that were the focus of the class. So, that's why it is super important to make sure that you reflect on, okay, are my assessment items matched to the learning targets that I've set out for my unit of study? And so, that's why, back to the teaching and learning cycle, assessment is a key aspect of teaching. So, a lot of times teachers sort of focus on the instructional activities that we want to be doing, but it all has to be connected together. We have the curriculum standards that are usually mandated by our state if we're working in public school settings. And we have to make sure that the curriculum, the assessment, and the instruction that we're thinking about those at the same time and developing those together. And that's what our first assignment, the curriculum-based assessment assignment, will be focused on, although it's more focused on the curriculum and assessment piece and less focused, not focused as much on instruction at all. And then this last slide, this link actually, which I know is not clickable, but if you Google it, or I can put it in our chat if you're interested. I thought it was kind of an interesting page. This just kind of shows how we retain information, and this is important to think about for assessment, particularly formative assessment, because it's so challenging to retain a lot of information. And so, over on the left-hand side here is sort of the input side of this might be where we're getting our learning experiences. So that's going to go in our immediate memory, but our immediate memory can't hold very much, and it doesn't hold very much for very long. So a lot of stuff is lost and doesn't even go into working memory. And the way to get things into working memory and then into that filing cabinet of long-term storage is by getting students to use it, getting students to rework with it, getting students to attach sense and attach meaning to it. And a lot of times, that's why having multimodal learning is often more beneficial, so that, for myself, for example, I remember things a lot more if it was a more immersive activity. I feel like I'm a more kinesthetic learner, but I think a lot of people do learn with more than one sense better, or when we're using more than one sense, we learn better. So anyway, that's it. That's a good short or hopefully fairly short introduction to the broad topics in our course and to our first chapter. Okay, thanks.